Good evening, everyone. It is wonderful to see you all. I know we have a couple of folks settling in still, so I would encourage us all to move towards the center, like at some of the places of worship that we attend, but I think we're okay. Just make sure there's space for other folks who are still coming in. I'm happy to welcome you. My name is Megan Radecki. It's my pleasure to serve as your director here at the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies at Grand Valley State University. We are thrilled to have you here, and I want to say welcome. We have community partners, we have students here, we have Hauenstein Center members. We also have a very special couple of guests. Our President Emeritus, President Lubbers, and his wife Nancy are here tonight. No pressure, Alon. It's not like you need to impress them or anything, but very, very happy to see them here along with all of you. Just, a quick note about the center and who we are and what we do. I just want to remind us as we talk about the Constitution tonight, and as we talk about, and as Professor Werman shares with us his insights, I just want to remind us all why we do what we do at the Hauenstein Center, right? Our mission is to raise a community of ethical and effective leaders for the 21st century, as inspired by the life of the very wonderful Colonel Ralph Hauenstein. But we come together on these nights to learn, to have discourse, to turn over ideas, to talk to each other as humans. And that's really what we're about. We don't host programming to tell you what we think is right or wrong. We don't host programming so that, you can go online and hide behind an avatar and, throw flaming darts at people who maybe believe different things than you. But we're really here to help make sense of the present day and what it means for all of us to be ethical and effective leaders together. So I just want to acknowledge it's been a rough couple weeks. And I think the collective coming away from all that is that we can do better, we must do better, and you all are doing better just by being here. So round of applause for all of you for getting out of your house tonight and coming out to be together to learn about important things. So happy Constitution Day. I was joking at lunch today with some folks that my 2-year-old this morning, when he got up, he's really into repeating things, and I said, Happy Constitution Day, and he repeated it, and I said, tell your friends at school, at daycare. Now you guys, if he says that to his friends, his little classmates' parents are gonna be like, that was a weird family and a weird kid who is wishing people Happy Constitution Day. But I'm thrilled to wish you all Happy Constitution Day. It is the 238th birthday of the Constitution, and a fun factoid, because Grand Valley receives federal funding, we are mandated to put on educational programming about the Constitution. So it has been the tradition of the Hauenstein Center to do that, and we are really grateful for the opportunity. If you haven't gotten one already, we do have pocket constitutions available at the check-in desk. So if you don't carry one around with you, I'd encourage you to do so, and feel free to grab one on your way out. Now with that, a big part of what we do at the Hauenstein Center is public programming. We also are so proud to host the Peter C. Cook Leadership Academy. This year we have 63 student fellows in our program. They cover over 30 majors and minors. They range from undergraduate to graduate degrees, and they are our future ethical and effective leaders. And we have a few in the audience. You guys want to raise your hands? Yes. One of our fellows is going to do the leadership minute for us this evening, and it is my privilege to introduce you to Lauren, or Lola Robar, as we know her. I'm going to read a little bit of her bio, and she's going to come up and share. Lauren, or Lola Robar, is a first-year graduate student pursuing her Master's of Public Administration. This is her second year in the CLA, and she's excited to be a lead fellow, which is a person who sort of serves as a small group leader and a helper for first-time students. She's excited to be a lead fellow and guide fellow candidates through the program. Lola is an advocate for community development, and she's a proud Laker alumna. She serves as a graduate assistant for the Peer Assisted Learning Program housed in the GVSU Tutoring and Reading Center. Lola hopes to work in education policy following her graduation increasing college access, and ensuring universities are enacting policies to serve the needs of their students. Please join me in welcoming Lola.
My name is Lola Robar, as you know, Megan just told you, but I'm a first-year Master's of Public Administration student here at Grand Valley. I currently serve as a lead fellow in the Cook Leadership Academy, and of course, I'm a proud alumna of GVSU. Most importantly, though, I'm an engaged citizen that's kind of worried about the state of our world. Throughout my childhood, my parents modeled how to serve others. My mom has been a nurse for 27 years, working with the sickest of patients, even during the COVID pandemic. My father dedicated his life to helping people tackle their chronic pain. No matter how tired they were, they volunteered their time and talents and inspired me to do the same. The steadfast commitment to the community is what led me to pursue my undergraduate degree in political science and public nonprofit administration. And I've seen firsthand just how important civic education and engagement can be for our understanding of the world around us. In an era of intense polarization throughout our nation, it is hard to make sense of the actions that our leaders and what is being reported on by the media. It has become clear to me that many Americans lack an understanding of our political system. I witnessed this reality firsthand when I was tutoring students in American government and constitutional foundations. Many of these students were first years and couldn't tell me the difference between state and federal governments or civil rights and civil liberties. In addition, two students from two very different school districts had vastly different understandings of our democracy. Now, I'm not saying that every citizen needs an extensive civic education, but I am saying that every person in America deserves to be educated on their rights, the role of government, how our leaders should behave, and most importantly, how important it is to be engaged within their community. In fact, the commitment to civic education and creating a safe space for discussion is the reason why I love the Hauenstein Center. Civic education is not prioritized in our country. Some states don't even require high school students to take American government or economics courses to graduate. This frightens me, because how are we supposed to make informed decisions for our democracy if no one has ever told us the rights that we have? The Hauenstein Center provides a space for people to not only learn about our government, but also interact and connect with community members. It is really easy to feel alone, especially if you get sucked into a social media echo chamber. Civic engagement is one of the most powerful forces against polarization and division. It is much harder to attack the opinions of somebody if you know them, you have a personal connection with them, and you see them as a person rather than someone on social media. But civic engagement also provides us with the opportunity to connect and share our voices with our community leaders. We live in a representative democracy, and in order for our government to work for us, we have to participate within our government. The reality is, it's ineffective to complain about the state of our government or world if you're not willing to do anything about it. Our nation was built on the idea that all people are created equal, but we haven't always been the best at carrying out this ideal. This can change, but we need to understand our privilege in all of this. There is a certain level of sheer luck that comes with being an American. The difference between me and any other 21-year-old girl in a low-income nation is simply geographical luck. The difference between me and someone else born into a different community is the fact that I was lucky enough to be born to a middle-class family in the suburbs of Detroit. And I'm lucky enough to have never been discriminated against because of my skin color. There is power in privilege. And I'm grateful for my parents, family, professors, and community members who have showed me how to use my privilege to uplift others and fight for equity, justice, and reform for everyone. Civic engagement provides us with the opportunity to interact and give back to the communities that shaped us. It provides an opportunity for dialogue with people you disagree with, and it challenges you to see yourself and others as a positive force for good. This doesn't just look like volunteering on a political campaign at your church or at a nonprofit. It also can involve volunteering at your children's school, going to libraries, parks, or any other community space that allows you to connect with others. I'd imagine that many of you are parents or grandparents. I cannot stress how important it is for your children or grandchildren to see you care about your community, fight against injustice, and use your privilege for good. And I challenge you to allow them to participate as well. At the end of the day, I'm still a toddler in a stroller featured on the front page of the Oakland Press, protesting for education funding. So I leave you with this, a quote from one of my favorite TV shows, The West Wing. Decisions are made by those who show up. How will you show up for your communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Lola, and thanks for the nod to the West Wing. I've been trying to figure out how to restream that. If anyone knows which channel or which service I can get that back on, would love to do that. But Lola is a leader, and we're so happy to have her in our midst. It's now my great delight to introduce you to the speaker of the evening, Professor Alon Werman. Alon is the Julius E. Davis Professor of Law at the University of Minnesota, where he teaches administrative law and constitutional law. He writes primarily on the 14th Amendment, administrative law, separation of powers, and constitutionalism. His academic writing has appeared in a variety of journals, and he is the author of a case book, Administrative Law Theory and Fundamentals, an Integrated Approach. He's litigated a variety of administrative law and constitutional law cases, including cases involving COVID-19 restrictions, transmission lines, and appointments clause challenges. We were fortunate to meet Alon when he came to visit us in February of 2024 for our Progressive Conservative Summit on Constitutional Reform. Some of you may remember him then, but we were so taken with him, and as our good friend Hillary Snell said, this guy's incredible, please have him back. So without further ado, here he is, Professor Alon Werman.
I did. I turned it on. Okay. Well, thank you for that very kind introduction. I just want to make sure I am equipped over here. I am. It is interesting that the bio had my case book as my written work, which is not unimportant. It is the most expensive thing I've ever written. So if you are going to buy one of my books, you should buy that one. But if you're going to read one of my books, as I was joking at lunch earlier today, I do have 2 books on the Constitution, which you could get for like, I don't know, 25 bucks, maybe on Amazon. I haven't checked. Prices have gone up. And I have a 3rd book on the way, as Megan knows, and hopefully I can come back someday to talk about that. But I'm going to give you actually a bit of a preview of what's in that book in one chapter of that 18-chapter book on the original Constitution. But okay. Let me actually start with what I was going to say. Thank you so much for having me here for this congressionally mandated lecture. Which I always love, a captive audience. The topic, mutually agreed upon, but suggested largely by the organizers, is making the rules, the president, the courts, and the Constitution. In an important respect, the title seems quite odd. Where is Congress? Doesn't Congress make the rules? Fair enough. And one of the central questions of modern administrative government is how much can Congress delegate discretion to the president and to the executive branch agencies? But in another respect, Congress's role here is somewhat less interesting, and I hate to disappoint the political science professors in the room. Congress has always delegated significant discretion to the executive, and it's unlikely to stop that practice anytime soon. The Supreme Court just last term, despite a 6-3 Republican-appointed majority, did not seem particularly interested in policing the scope of delegations of legislative power. We have the tariff case coming up. That might be a non-delegation case, but my guess is they'll decide that on the statutory question. Okay, so in this sense, I do think it's appropriate to focus on the role of the presidency and the courts vis-a-vis modern administrative government. That is, the administrative agencies that make most of the rules and regulations that govern our lives. Okay. So my goal then, in 45 minutes or so, which reminds me there's no clock in here, so I'm going to take that out, will be to speak to both issues, time permitting, the presidency first, and second, the courts, and to give you a sense of where the modern Supreme Court is going, what are the recent developments, and what are the controversial issues. But my real goal is to tell you what I think the right answer is to the questions that are being litigated today, and that I will pose here to you all. and even more specifically, to tell you something about these questions or propose an answer that might be novel, that you might not have heard before, because I assume at least some of you are somewhat familiar with the Constitution. So I'm going to try to say some interesting and new things. So I'll start with the presidency. We'll see how long I go on this. It is the Hauenstein Center on the study for the presidency. And so I figured I should start here and see how long it goes. And any time permitting, I guess I'll talk about the courts, since that also is not entirely uninteresting. The question of the day is whether the Supreme Court will overturn a 90-year-old precedent, Humphrey's executor against United States, that upheld the constitutionality of so-called independent agencies. What makes agencies independent? The conventional wisdom, which is partly true in this respect, is that commissioners at the heads of these agencies or independent commissions, they are independent because they are insulated from the president's ability to remove them. In most of these statutes creating these independent agencies, it provides that the principal officers, usually it's a multi-member, bipartisan, staggered terms, but it doesn't have to be. But the principal officers, the commissioners at the heads of these agencies, can only be fired or removed for cause. And the conventional wisdom is that simply disagreeing with the president as to a matter of policy is not sufficient cause to remove. And that's not cause. And usually the statutes actually say inefficiency, neglect of duty, malfeasance in office, right? Is disagreeing with the president inefficient? Not exactly. Are you neglecting your duty? Well, no, not if you think you're following the statute. Are you malfeasant? Well, if you're not embezzling money, chances are you aren't malfeasant, right? So again, the theory here is that merely disagreeing as a matter of policy with the president is not sufficient grounds to remove. So that's what makes these commissioners, these agency heads, independent. They can independently exercise their policy views. They can employ their independent policy expertise in administering their small portion of the United States government. Could be a very big portion, actually, SEC, FTC, but they're siloed portion of the US government. Okay. So those of you who have been paying attention already know that the Trump administration thinks this case, Humphrey's executor, was wrongly decided. President Trump has removed several commissioners at the head of various independent agencies, including the National Labor Relations Board, the Federal Trade Commission, the Merit Systems Protection Board, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Didn't he remove Democratic members of the Federal Election Commission? I think he also did that. And then the Equal Employment and Opportunity Commission. So they're serious about this. Like they're really challenging this case, and they want a showdown in the Supreme Court. Now, President Trump has also most recently removed Lisa Cook, a Federal Reserve governor. This is a bit different. I don't think it's as exciting for me. I mean, it's exciting politically, I guess, to the extent politics can excite anyone. But from a constitutional perspective, he purported to remove Lisa Cook for cause. And so chances are that's how it's going to be decided. If I were a betting man, the Supreme Court's just going to say, the statute doesn't define cause. Being accused of mortgage fraud is probably good enough cause. We're not going to get into a fight about this. That's my guess. It might even be 9-0, but it'll probably be 6-3 or 7-2. So I don't think it's that constitutionally interesting, but it does raise the question of whether the Fed is different. Okay, some people have suggested this, right? That maybe the president does have control over executive power, the administration of the government, but monetary policy is different, it's special, it's scary, it's unique in some way, and so the Federal Reserve can be insulated from presidential control. The Supreme Court of the United States has suggested as much in a case recently on its so-called shadow docket, the emergency docket. So not on the merits of the case, but it has suggested, there's an exception for the Fed. I'm dubious, but I'll come back to that because I think there's a kind of a neat solution to that problem as well. Okay, that's the set piece for what I want to talk about. So what I want to do now is tell you what I think the answer is to this question. What is the original conception of the presidency with respect to control over administration? What is the original meaning of the Constitution in terms of the president's power to control administrative government, to appoint and remove and direct the various officers of the government? So that's the question for the bulk of my time. And what I'd like to do is the following, just so you all can keep track. I'll lay out the two conventional views on the president's power to control administration. They very much disagree with each other. And then I'm going to suggest that both of these views are wrong. Okay? Or more charitably, neither of these views is quite right. This may be the more charitable way to say it. So I'm going to explain these views, and I'm going to describe what my argument is. What was the president's original role intended to be? Then, somewhat out of order, I'm going to tell you why I think this matters, why, the implications of my approach, my thesis, because some of you in the audience might think, this guy's just making up distinctions, just splitting hairs, but I want to convince you that what I'm going to say matters. And then I will try to convince you of the evidence for the view. All right, so that's where this is going. Well, let's start with the two competing views of presidential control over administration. What are these two competing views? The first view tends to be shared by originalists, textualists, formalists, conservative legal scholars. I'm not going to call it any of these things because both views root their arguments in the text and structure of the Constitution. So actually everybody here is arguing as to the original meaning of the text. Okay, so I'm going to call this first view the anti-administrativist view, the ones skeptical of independent agency power. Okay, according to this view, favored by most conservatives, formalists, textualists, originalists today, all duties and any discretion that Congress, by statute, vests in some subordinate officer in the government, the Secretary of the Treasury, an Assistant United States Attorney, the U.S. Trade Representative, whichever subordinate officer in the government. Under this view, all of the duties and discretion given by Congress to that subordinate officer is ultimately the president's to exercise. That the president can control and exercise this discretion through the power to direct and instruct and control the officer and to remove them, right, if they disagree. Okay, so both removal and control. Now, this view creates a series of potential problems or puzzles, depending on one's point of view. Some might worry about an imperial presidency on the domestic front, right? I mean, Congress delegates incredibly broad power, incredibly broad discretion to administrative agencies today. And, a sensible person who, in 1789, 88, foreseeing 230 years in the future, might have thought differently about giving the president all this power over the control of domestic regulations and rulemaking and administration. So that's one possibility. People can disagree about that. More pertinently for my purposes, this view seems to make the opinions clause in the Constitution superfluous. What is the opinions clause? Most people don't realize that the president actually has very few powers listed in the Constitution, right? There's a grant of executive power, whatever that means. I have a theory about that, which I'll get into. And then the president's commander-in-chief. The president can pardon, can commission officers, can receive ambassadors, can appoint officers by and with advice and consent of the Senate. And then it has this opinions clause, which reads, he may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments upon any subject relating to the duties of their respective offices. What work does the opinions clause do? Why is the opinions clause in the Constitution, right? If the president can remove and direct and control and order officers to execute their duties in a certain way, doesn't that imply or include the power to tell them, hey, give me information about how you are exercising your duty? In other words, doesn't the greater power to direct and remove include the power, or at least doesn't the greater power to remove them include the lesser power to demand that they give you information about their duties on threat of removal? And certainly if the executive power includes the power to direct and control them, that would also seem the power to include the power to control and direct them as to giving opinions about, like, let me know what you're doing with respect to your duties. So this anti-administrative view does seem to pose a redundancy problem with the opinions clause. The formalists who adopt this view for their part say, yeah, but so what? Right? I mean, there is a canon of interpretation in the law that says you should avoid, all else being equal, you should avoid interpretations that render some part of the law superfluous. But a wise scholar with whom I disagree about basically everything, except this, once said, redundancy, it's good in airplanes and it's good in constitutions. And maybe that's right. Maybe that's right. There are some redundancies, especially, due process clause, ex post facto, but so I'm not saying, you always have to avoid redundancy. And for the most part, the conservatives who adopt this view say, yeah, it's redundant, but so what? Or it's confirmatory. Okay. So that's one view. The standard formalist, textualist, originalist, conservative view that all of this discretion that Congress vests in officers, subordinate officers, is really the president's. The president's power to exercise. Okay, that's view one. View two is what I will call the pro-administrativist argument. This argument says, or holds or maintains, that the president is merely a persuader in chief. That the president has neither a constitutional power or right to remove officers, nor a constitutional power as a default, right, to control or direct them. Congress can always authorize the president to do these things, but that's a matter for Congress. So one view is, yes, remove and control. The other view is neither control nor remove. This second view, this pro-administrative independence view, so to speak, takes what the famous political scientist Richard Neustadt described as the president's practical power, right, the power to persuade, and elevates it to constitutional status, which like Neustadt did not do. Now, this reading of the Constitution has some virtues. It makes the opinions clause not superfluous, right? The president doesn't have a constitutional right, absent congressional statute authorizing the president to do so, to command and direct or remove the officers under the president, except with respect to providing the opinions, right? So they must always inform the president of what they're doing. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't sound super satisfying to me, because like, what's the point of giving the president the power to ask opinions of the subordinate officers if the president can't do anything with that? Right? And so this is where I think Chief Justice Roberts has called this the cajoler-in-chief view. You know, the president gets to cajole and pester officers of the government to try to do what the president wants. Peter Strauss, a professor emeritus at Columbia University, said, well, the president can mobilize other actors in the federal government that agree with him about things, and then they could all be kind of fighting amongst each other. Look, fine, maybe. Certainly makes the opinions clause not superfluous, but it doesn't do much work. More importantly, it's rather inconsistent with about 200 years of experience of presidential power, and there's basically no historical evidence that anyone near the founding adopted this view, okay, which I think is the bigger problem for this view. Okay, so that's what everybody thinks. Why is everybody wrong about this? Like, what is the answer? Okay, well, I would like to propose my thesis that the original conception of the presidency is that the president has a constitutional right to remove any principal officer of the government, but does not have a constitutional right to direct or control them. Now, or more precisely, the only constitutional power the president has to direct and control is the power to demand opinions. And then when the president receives those opinions about their duties, the president can then intelligently exercise this power to remove if necessary. Okay, I told you, I see it in your eyes. You all think I'm splitting hairs. Let me explain why I think this matters. First, as I just said, it makes the opinions clause do work, right? The president doesn't have a constitutional right to direct, but he can in this one respect, or at least the principal, let me be more precise. There is no constitutional obligation on the part of the principal officers to obey the president. The president anyone can bark orders, right? The president can say, go get my coffee to Scott Bessent. And Scott Bessent can say, Mr. President, I just read Congress's statutes. I don't see anywhere where it's part of my duties to fetch your coffee. Right? Now, the president can direct with respect to anything, and Scott Bessent could say, okay, I don't think that's what the Treasury statutes require, so I'm going to do something else. You could always bark orders. Anybody could talk. Anybody could bloviate, just like I'm doing right now. Whether anyone has to obey the president is the question. And under this view, the opinions clause says, in this one respect, the principal officers do have to obey. And then that gives the president information to exercise the power that he has, namely the power to remove officers. Okay. Another virtue, I think it sensibly distributes accountability and expertise, because it sensibly distributes political costs in the following sense. I think everybody intuitively understands that the power of removal comes at a much higher political cost than the power to simply direct someone, right? Just ask Richard Nixon, right? Richard Nixon wanted to fire Special Counsel Archibald Cox. If there was a constitutional obligation on the part of the principal officers to obey, then the Attorney General would have said, I've got to obey. But no, he didn't quite fire them. He was going to fire them. So the Attorney General resigned, then the Deputy Attorney General resigned, and then the Associate Attorney General, Robert Bork, said, I'll do it. Okay? That came at a huge political cost. I mean, think about it. We call it the Saturday Night Massacre. Okay. Something we haven't talked about. I should really find out what day this all happened. Let's say Tuesday Night Massacre. I don't actually know. Andrew Jackson fired 2 Treasury secretaries who refused to remove the deposits from the Bank of the United States in the 1830s, the bank that he was basically trying to destroy. Came at a huge political cost to the administration, which he ultimately overcame. President Trump fired Comey, which led to a whole investigation that consumed much of the president's first administration, right? So firing someone is a powerful tool of control, but it comes at a political cost, okay? In the same way that pardoning someone comes at a much higher political cost than simply quietly telling your United States attorney not to prosecute somebody, right? So I think everybody understands intuitively that it's a powerful tool that the president has, but it comes at a cost to exercise. But not only that, the political cost of exercising this power to remove subordinate officers goes up, ratchets up even further to the extent one believes the president does not have that constitutional right to control, right? Think about it. If your view is, well, the president gets to be, has all the executive power, so yeah, of course he should be able to remove you if you're not listening to the president. Well, but if your view is actually no, that the way the Constitution works is that it is the obligation and duty of the officers to whom Congress assigns duties to exercise their discretion and judgment in executing those duties, right? Then it's improper to attempt to interfere through a removal, which ratchets the political cost even more. Okay, so again, let me summarize the point I'm trying to make here. If I'm right about this, which you're still all just taking this on faith, but I'm right, which I'm getting to that part. If I'm right about this, then I think, again, it solves this middle way for presidential power that successfully allows for accountability, political accountability, while allowing for an appropriate degree of agency independence and expertise. Let me put it the following way, since again, this is the Hauenstein Center for Presidential Studies. I'm not sure I'm getting the exact name right, but definitely the presidency's in there, okay? Edward Corwin, very, very famous professor of law in the mid-20th century, professor of presidential power, wrote several editions of his treatise on executive power, observed in his treatise, and I'm going to quote, that an unqualified adoption of either of the 2 standard accounts that I've just laid out of presidential power, quote, would invite startling results. If one adopts the more standard formalist anti-administrativist position, right, that all of this discretion is the president's, Corwin said, that would make questions of law enforcement, questions of discretion, the discretion, moreover, of an independent and legally uncontrollable branch of the government. Such a view would render it impossible for Congress to leave anything, to the specially trained judgment of the subordinate executive official with any assurance that his discretion would not be perverted to political ends for the advantage of the administration in power. Again, we've already covered this, right? All of this discretion would be the president's, which could be perverted to political ends. Yet he said an unqualified adoption of what I've called the persuader-in-chief view would hold out consequences equally unwelcome, allowing Congress to divide and transfer control of law execution into a parliamentary despotism. Well, I think if my account is true, if it's true, then it would nicely balance accountability and expertise in a way that solves this dilemma that Corwin posed, right? By giving the president an ultimate back-end check on how everything is being administered, but ultimately requires us to believe and accept that the duties these officers exercise are theirs to exercise, and they must deploy their judgment, and it would be improper for the president to interfere with those duties. So I think it solves that puzzle. Okay. You might not care one bit about any of the normative arguments I just made about accountability, expertise. Fortunately, I'm right on the history and the text. I actually think there is substantial evidence that this is how they thought about presidential power. Okay, so that's what I'm now going to go through. Let me start with the meaning of executive power. There's a debate, which I'm not going to super bore you with, because again, it's one of these things where almost everybody's wrong about it. the executive power, is this residuum of all executive type powers? Is it a grant of inherent executive powers? Is it a residuum, a grant of all royal prerogative powers? Or is it, merely a reference to the other specifically enumerated powers in the Constitution that I mentioned, like commander-in-chief, pardon, opinions clause, and so on? I'm just going to propose to you that the actual answer is the executive power vested in the president is the power to execute law. That's it. That's what it means. It's what gives the president the power to execute the laws that Congress has enacted. Now, does this mean the president can personally execute the law? Most originalists, by the way, most formalists, these are the more conservative. I'm using these terms without defining them, but the conservatives who support executive power and who want to interpret the Constitution with its original meaning, most of them also think that the president does not have a right to personally execute the law. But there are some dissension. There's some dissent here. There are some scholars who think the president can personally step in to the shoes of any officer and personally execute the law, right? So you remember the Eric Adams, all the AUSAs didn't want to dismiss the prosecution. And eventually, was it the deputy or one of the high officials? Under this view, the president himself could have marched into Manhattan courthouse, not as a defendant, but as the prosecutor, saying, I'm going to exercise their discretion, right? Most people think this is wrong, and that is wrong. The power to execute the law, or the executive power, does not include the power personally to execute the law. We know this from William Blackstone's commentaries, which are hugely influential on the founders. We know this from Sir Edward Coke. All of this is just, I'm sorry if I go over. I told Kaylor that I can't say exactly how long this is going to be because it depends the kind of mood that I'm in, and I'm quite sleep deprived. So that's the mood that I'm in. So let me tell you about Sir Edward Coke and the case of prohibitions del roi, or the prohibitions of the king from, I believe it was 1607 or 1608, where King James I wanted to personally sit in judgment in cases. And Sir Edward Coke and the common law judges all got together and said, no king since the conquest, of course, since the Norman conquest of 1066, has purported to personally execute the law and sit in judgment. This has always been left to the common law judges. Coke goes on to say, the king can't even arrest anybody. It has to be the king's officers. Why, by the way? Because of something called sovereign immunity, right? Because the king can do no wrong. So if the king actually does wrong, legally there's nothing you could do. So you send the officers to execute the law instead, because you can always sue them. Today you can't, because we do things differently today, okay? But back then you could sue the officers, right? So there's no question that the executive power was understood to be the power to oversee the execution of the law, not to personally execute the law, okay? Well, so if the president, or the king, now the president, couldn't personally execute the law, how was he, someday she, to oversee the execution of the law? Well, it turns out that everybody understood, and even my academic nemesis agree with me about this. Okay, so here's one point of true agreement, that the executive power was understood to include the power to appoint officers to assist in the execution. Okay, and so this would allow anybody with the executive power to appoint officers to assist, and the president would be able to oversee the execution of the law that way. At the Constitutional Convention, for what it's worth, if you want more evidence, they debated what is executive power, what is the extent of executive authority, and they concluded that the executive should have power to carry into effect the national laws and to appoint officers not otherwise provided for. That was it. That's what they said, right? Until they gave a bunch of other prerogative powers, at the end, like the commander-in-chief power, and so on. Okay, why is this important? Because it tells us something about the removal power too. Which is what? And this is sort of the crux of part of the crux, one of the two cruxes of the argument, I suppose. Crux number one. The power to, there was a common law maxim, deeply ingrained, Thomas Jefferson, Madison, everybody decided to discuss this, that the power to remove follows from the power to appoint. The removal power is incident to the appointment power. Why does this make sense? Because if you have the power to appoint somebody, well, you can remove them by appointing someone else. So actually, a lot of commissions in colonial Virginia, for example, commissioned an officer saying X, Y, or Z is hereby appointed, and A, B, or C is hereby removed by virtue of the new appointment. Okay, this is important. Why? I'm getting a little into the weeds, but why not? Michael McConnell has this famous book on the presidency that came out a few years ago with Princeton University Press. It's a very good book called The President Who Would Not Be King. But McConnell, who was also a judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals before, he was a professor before, then a judge, and then a professor again after. He says in his book, it is inexplicable that the Constitutional Convention, that the delegates never talked about the removal power. How could they possibly have not talked about the removal power? There's an answer to the question, which is as follows. Until September 7, I'd like to say, maybe it was September 4. I don't want to mislead you exactly. Don't take me to the bank, but it was in September, the very last weeks of the convention. Until then, the draft Constitution assigned part of the appointment power to the Senate and part of the appointment power to the President. The Senate had the appointment of judges and ambassadors. The President had the appointment of all other officers. So you don't need to talk about the removal power, because the President would remove the officers whom he appoints through making new appointments. The Senate would remove ambassadors through making new appointments. They didn't need to talk about it. So what happened in September, 2 weeks before the Constitution was finalized? The Committee on Postponed Matters, kind of in a big thing to postpone, decided actually we're going to give the appointment power all to the President, by and with advice and consent of the Senate. So instead of dividing the appointment power, they now shared it between the two of them, thus raising the question too late in the convention, well, what does this mean for removal? Under the common law maxim, does it suggest that the President and the Senate together must remove by making a new appointment? This is what several members of Congress argued in 1789 in the Great Debate when they established the Department of War and the Department of Foreign Affairs and the Department of Treasury. They debated, what do we do with these principal officers? Can the President fire them? They debated this for 5 excruciatingly long days, by the way, and you could go to the Annals of Congress and read this. Because it wasn't resolved in the convention, because of this last-minute change from the Brearley Committee, the Committee on Postponed Matters. So in 1789, when they were establishing the new departments, they debated this question. And some people said exactly that. This was called the senatorial faction. You could only remove officers by appointing new ones. The President and the Senate together had to do it. And James Madison said, I would agree with you because of the common law maxim. Removal is incident to appointment, if nothing else in the Constitution spoke to the question. But he said something else in the Constitution does speak to the question, namely the Take Care Clause. Gives the President the duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. This implies, Madison said, that he had the species of power necessary to fulfill that duty. If the Senate had a back-end check on the removal and effectively do what's called the legislative veto today on a presidential removal, that would effectively give the Senate the final say over faithful execution. This would be transferring the duty to the Senate. Madison also made an argument about the vesting clause. Ultimately, appointment and removal are both an incident of this power to oversee law execution, he said. The Constitution modifies the appointment part by giving the Senate a share, but not the removal power, he said. Fine, less convincing than the take care argument, for what it's worth. So they debated, and after 5 days of the debate, they concluded that the President ought to have the power to remove, and then they, in fact, changed the language to make it appear as though they weren't conferring this power. Right? In what is, I think, the only acceptable use of the passive voice in the English language that I've ever encountered, they said, when said principal officer shall have been removed by the President, to make it clear that the President already had that power, instead of saying that the President shall remove the officer, which reads kind of like a grant, right, of power. So they debated, and that's what they ultimately concluded, that the President, as a matter of constitutional right, has this power to remove principal officers. Again, this is a little in the weeds, but the fascinating thing is no, it's too much in the weeds. All right, I will move on. To see exercising judgment. Okay. So now I really get to the heart of my thesis, which is, okay, so the President can remove the principal officers, but just because he can remove them doesn't mean he has a right to control them in the exercise of their discretion. This is the key move that I'm making, this key innovation. Okay? It turns out there's lots of evidence for this view if you only know to look. So here, for example, I'm going to give sort of three buckets. One has to do with settling accounts, legal claims against the government. If they owe you on a contract, or the mail carrier drives over your foot, and you have a claim against them, or whatever. Claims against the government, money claims against the government. Some about the Constitution allows Congress to vest the appointment of inferior officers in the principal officers. And then there's more general evidence. Okay. And in these three buckets, you see time and again presidents from, including Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Chief Justice Taft. Those of you in the know understand why I'm shocked and surprised by this. All said, just because the president can remove an officer does not mean the president has the right to interfere with the exercise of that officer's duties. So here is an example, some examples with respect to the Comptroller of the Treasury, who was the officer that Congress designated to resolve claims against the government, right? Contract disputes, veterans' pensions, when you're wrongfully denied money that the government owes you, and so on. A lot of people wrote Washington letters asking, hey, can you see to it that I get paid on my revolutionary, the invalid veteran statute and such and such? And he wrote in one letter, for example, my public situation forbids any interference in questions of individual claims otherwise than as they may come before me officially in the form of an act of Congress. This will be satisfactory to you for my declining to direct any investigation into the vouchers which you mention. I'm not going to look into a particular incident of how the comptroller is executing the law and deciding these claims. That's his duty, not my duty. Okay. In another letter, he said, I have no power, nor would there be any propriety in my interfering with the settlement of accounts, unless it be in the case of malpractice in the officer. I get to ensure faithful execution of the law, but that doesn't mean I get to interfere in individual acts of discretion. Thomas Jefferson similarly wrote, you can imagine that they were getting exasperated by these requests. With the settlement of the accounts at the Treasury, I have no right to interfere in the least. The comptroller is the relevant officer. He is the sole and supreme judge in all claims for money against the United States and would no more receive a direction from me as to his rules of evidence than one of the judges of the Supreme Court. Okay, let's fast forward. There's other evidence, but I'm going to skip to Chief Justice Taft. Why is this so fascinating? Because Chief Justice Taft was a president of, that's a great career path, by the way, anyone who's curious. Be president of the United States, finish out your term, and then say, I think I'll retire as Chief Justice of the United States. That was Taft. And he authored the key opinion, Myers v. United States, affirming the president's power to remove officers, right, which was then limited in Humphrey's executor, right, the case with which we started. So even Chief Justice Taft, whom everybody blames as having established this unitary executive, the president gets to remove and control all of administration. Even he didn't say that. In a book he wrote on presidential powers after his office, he talked about the comptroller of the Treasury, and he said that the president may always remove the comptroller, quote, but under the act of Congress creating the office, the president cannot control or revise the decisions of the officer. Remove, yes, if I need to, but I cannot control and direct them in the specific exercises of their duty. In Myers itself, in a passage that people mysteriously forget about, he said the following: there may be duties of a quasi-judicial character imposed on executive officers like the comptroller, right, and members of executive tribunals whose decisions after hearing affect interests of individuals, the discharge of which the president cannot in any particular case properly influence or control. But he said, even in such a case, the president may consider the decision after its rendition as a reason for removing the officer, on the ground that the discretion regularly entrusted to that officer by statute has not been on the whole intelligently or wisely exercised. Removal, yes, but no interference with the specific duties. Yes, okay, I will say something, but largely skip this question on inferior officer appointments. So Congress often vested the appointment of inferior officers, like a first-class postmaster, in the principal officer, the postmaster general. So the postmaster general had the power, the duty to appoint the postmaster for the various cities. And there came a case before James Madison where Madison removed the postmaster general because he didn't like the appointments that the postmaster general was making. But even here, in explaining his decision, he said, it's because the Postmaster General has ignored the will of the people of Philadelphia as to whom they want as their postmaster. He didn't say because he didn't follow my orders, right? So even here, when there was a removal for the purpose of explaining your disapproval of something that an officer did, he did not purport to direct the officer. He actually in the letter said, I made my sentiments known, which is different than saying I directed and commanded, right? Anyway, so that's just a funny episode, but let me skip that and go to some other more general evidence and some fun history. This is not limited just to claims against the government, inferior officers' appointments. There's other evidence of this too, including the famous, I don't know what you'd call this, showdown between Daniel Webster and Andrew Jackson over the Bank of the United States. So Andrew Jackson did not like the Bank of the United States. He wanted to withdraw the US Treasury deposits from the Second Bank of the United States. What was the problem? The law only permitted the Secretary of the Treasury to do so. So here we get the Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday night massacre, whatever it was a massacre, okay, before the Saturday night massacre. The Treasury of the Secretary, Louis McLean, decided, I really don't think that this is good, and Congress needs reasons. If I do this, I don't think I have good reasons, so I'm not going to do it. So he was sacked. He was reassigned, okay? Demotion, right, from Secretary of the Treasury. I think he ended up in the State Department, which I guess is a demotion, okay? So then he appointed William Duane because, he thought that William Duane would agree with him. And I think William Duane, when you look at, probably thought he also agreed with him, and then he got cold feet. He said, actually, I have to explain myself to Congress, and I don't know that I can. So he got sacked. He got removed. And so who was the third person appointed? So, in the Saturday Night Massacre for Nixon, it was Robert Bork. Who was, does anyone know? Who was the person, Roger B. Taney, who would subsequently be, not that I want to connect him to Bork, I think that's an unfair comparison, of course, but they're always, robust views of executive power. So Taney said, okay, I'll remove the deposits. Okay, so that's the background. Daniel Webster, the US Senate censured Andrew Jackson for this. Why did you censure Andrew Jackson for this? Because he improperly, this is where King Andrew I comes from, and there are other, but this is part of the argument, that he was interfering with the administration of the government. But I am the administration, right? No, but this is the argument the Senate made. And Daniel Webster said, nobody doubts the president's constitutional power to remove the officer. But everyone understands, he said, that it was done with the purpose of interfering with the duties of the secretaries improperly. And that therefore was an abuse of power. Right? So here's what Daniel Webster said in defense of the Senate's censure. Quote, all are able to, this is a bit long, but it's good. It's Daniel Webster. All are able to see the difference between the power to remove the secretary from office and the power to control him in all or any of his duties while in office. The law charges the officer, whoever he may be, with the performance of certain duties. The president, with the consent of the Senate, appoints an individual to be such an officer, and this individual he may remove, if he so please. But until removed, he is the officer and remains charged with the duties of his station, duties which nobody else can perform, and for the neglect or violation of which he is liable to be impeached, the Secretary of Treasury. The president, it is true, may terminate his political life, but he cannot control his powers and functions and act upon him as a mere machine while he is allowed to live. Okay, now, to be sure, Andrew Jackson maybe disagreed with this, right? Maybe Andrew Jackson is counter evidence. Andrew Jackson was a watershed, by the way, right? The portrait of executive power I'm painting to you was more or less how people thought about it until Jackson, for what it's worth. So Jackson is counter evidence to this view. Jackson adopts this more robust understanding of presidential control over administration, but that's 30 years after the founding, 30 plus years after the founding, right? But even here, and I love this part of it, even here, Andrew Jackson defended his action by saying he didn't direct or order anybody to do anything. Okay, so we have the notes of the cabinet meeting in which they were discussing the question of US deposits in the bank. And I think he had removed McLean already. So, the threat was sort of hanging in the air. But he said the following: in the remarks he has made on this all-important question, he trusts the Secretary of the Treasury will see only the frank and respectful declarations of the opinions which the President has formed on a measure of great national interest deeply affecting the character and usefulness of his administration, and not a spirit of dictation, which the President would be as careful to avoid as ready to resist. Happy will he be if the facts now disclosed produce uniformity of opinion and unity of action among the members of the administration. Okay, look, the threat of removal was hanging in the air, but even here he knew that he wanted to avoid the appearance as though he were interfering with the duties of the Secretary of the Treasury. Okay, so maybe it's not so much counter evidence as I thought it was initially when I started writing the paper, which is the basis of this talk. Okay. Let me say one other fascinating piece of evidence, which there's at least 2 lawyers in here, and they'll appreciate. Yeah, I'm looking at the general counsel of this university. So I talked about the decision of, or the so-called decision of 1789, where they debated who has the removal power, Senate, President alone. There are some other views that I didn't talk about, right? And they decided the President alone. And I already mentioned the fact that in the course of this debate, they specifically altered the language to appear as though they were not conferring a power to remove, right? But rather that the power to remove already existed as a matter of constitutional right. In that very same debate, they did that also with the appointment power. The very first draft of the legislation establishing the departments said, the President, by and with advice and consent, shall appoint the officer. And they struck it. They said, oh, the Constitution already says that. We don't want to appear as though we are conferring that power, which the Constitution already grants. So twice, with respect to appointments and with respect to removals, they were very careful to amend the language to avoid the impression that Congress was conferring discretion that the Constitution already gave the President. With that background, we find this little gem in that law. The said principal officer shall conduct the business of the said department in such manner as the President of the United States shall from time to time order or instruct. Wow. Okay, that was the big reveal. Okay. So again, right, without the statutory authorization, would the President have had inherent authority to instruct? Right? They studiously avoided conferring power on the President in this law that the Constitution already gave the President. And here they are conferring the power to direct and instruct. So maybe the President really does have this power to remove, but not a right to direct and control. Okay. 7:30? What did we say? I'm probably not going to talk about the courts, but that's okay. People talk about the courts too much anyway. So let me say a few things to kind of bring this portion to a close, or I guess the talk, since I'm running out of time. The thesis is that the President, what is the original conception of the presidency with respect to the President's control over administration? The thesis I've just argued is that, at least as originally understood, the President had a constitutional right to remove officers, but not necessarily a constitutional right to control the officers. Removal is more politically costly, and moreover, that cost, as I said, goes up to the extent one believes the President does not have the right to use that power to interfere, right? But only to correct malpractices. This, I suggest, creates a happy balance, at least it makes me happy, of accountability and expertise. Now, in conclusion, let me apply this to the so-called Federal Reserve exception. Which again, where does that come from? I want to suggest there is no Federal Reserve exception, but that this scheme, this conception of executive power, of presidential power, actually nicely balances the competing concerns and accommodations. Can President Trump remove, who is it, Jerome Powell? I think I should have prepped this better. Can remove Jerome Powell if he really wants and if he dare suffer the political costs. Maybe he's willing to do it. He has a lot of political capital right now, but you'll notice even he hasn't removed Jerome Powell. And everybody knows he wants to. Is that because the political cost is high? And to the extent we believe that Congress intended the Federal Reserve to exercise its duties and execute its duties with a degree of expertise and independence from the president, then a removal would be even more politically costly because the president would be purporting to interfere with the duties of the Federal Reserve. So let the president remove, if he dare. Maybe we'll get some senator like Daniel Webster to, unlikely. But nevertheless, you can imagine a senator like Daniel Webster getting up there and having this showdown with the president as to the propriety of such a removal, which again, I think would happily balance this need, or sensibly, happily, yeah, it's too normative, sensibly balance this, subjective, I should say, sensibly balance these competing objectives of expertise on the one hand and accountability on the other. Okay, yeah, I'm not gonna talk about, I was gonna talk about Chevron deference and courts deferring to agency interpretations of law, but that's already a little heady and it's already 7 o'clock. So thank you for your attention. That is the presidency, and I'm happy to take any questions about that or really anything else about the Constitution or the present moment or legal academia or really anything at all. So thank you for your attention. Sorry if that was too in the weeds. I cut out a lot of the weeds, by the way, so you're welcome.
All right, we'll kind of go back and forth across the room with our questions.
I thought about a lot of different ways I could ask this question. I'm going to keep it really simple. Is an executive order a law?
No. What are executive orders? There was a time when executive orders were law. The time was the 1530s. The ruler was Henry VIII, and Parliament enacted what was called the Statute of Proclamations, which purported to allow the king to issue proclamations and give them the force of law. And William Blackstone, in his commentaries on the laws of England, famously wrote that this was calculated to introduce the most despotic of tyrannies, which fortunately was repealed shortly thereafter when Henry VIII died in the minority of his successor. Okay. So what are executive orders? Okay. Properly understood, executive orders are directions, instructions to executive branch officials as to how the president wants them to execute the law. But such executive orders can never transgress Congress's statutes. So you'll notice at the end of every executive order, it'll say, nothing in here shall be construed as being inconsistent with applicable law. Right? So basically, to the extent the law allows you to choose policy A, B, or C, I, the president, instruct you or want you to choose option B, whatever most advances racial equity, which was an order of the Biden administration, or whatever advances some other priority, right? Helps renew energy independence, right? Now, under my conception of executive power, unless Congress's statutes gave the president this power to direct them, those would really be merely advisory, even within the scope of congressionally conferred discretion, right? But a lot of, and which is why executive orders, for what it's worth, almost never have been made to apply to independent agencies, because the presidents have, even President Trump, did he do it recently? I don't think so. I have to check on this. Even his administration, even his lawyers have not purported to issue executive orders directing independent commissions to act in a certain way, right? They work under the assumption, which was articulated by Justice Kagan when she was a law professor at Harvard Law School, that Congress's statutes conferring discretion on independent agencies should be interpreted as giving them independent discretion, but any delegation of authority to an executive office of the president agency, or something within non-independent, so like the EPA, the Secretary of Treasury, should be construed as including permission for the president to order them around. That's kind of the framework that she laid out. So an executive order directed consistently with that understanding of congressional power to direct subordinate officers, where Congress wants that, within the scope of applicable law, are not laws, and they're perfectly constitutional. To the extent an executive order goes beyond that and purports to do something new, you could say it's an improper attempt at making law, and then the court will strike it down in a proper case as exceeding statutory authority. What is exceeding statutory authority if not you're making new law? You're going beyond the statute, right? And so properly done executive orders are not or regulations, right? This whole talks about rulemakings, right? Are actually not laws, right? They're simply implementing, right, the directions already given from Congress. It's an execution of the laws of Congress, if they're within Congress's statutes. One final point, and then I'll stop. Now, Congress's statutes can be so broad. This is the delegation problem that I said I wasn't going to talk about, right? That in effect, all of the executive's orders or regulations feel like lawmaking. But that's not because there's something inherent about executive orders that makes them law, but rather because Congress's statutes are so broad and open-ended that it effectively confers policy-making authority to the president, lawmaking authority to the president, under the guise of merely executing the law. That's the non-delegation problem, right? Everybody loves, why does Congress, by the way, this is classic public choice theory. Why does Congress, I said I would stop, but I'm going to do what professors do and filibuster. Non-delegation makes perfect sense from a rational actor. Why? Who can possibly vote against a law that says, we want clean air? There shall be clean air in the United States. Who's going to vote against that? So you win brownie points with your constituents for such a broad and open-ended law. And then on the back end, when the EPA has to decide who's going to stop producing coal and who's going to stop polluting to meet that requirement, then the members of Congress say, oh, I didn't mean that. I didn't realize that you would be heard in that way. I'm going to lobby the agency on your behalf. So it's a win-win. I win on the front end because I want clean air, and I win on the back end because I'm going to lobby the agency for you, right? Which is why we get these broad delegations of power that effectively cede lawmaking power to the executive. But that's a question of the non-delegation doctrine, not a matter of executive orders as such, if that makes sense. Thank you for letting me, as I've been saying, since I learned that Trump calls it the weave, I've been kind of like weaving in and like trying to bring it back. I'm trying to get better at it, so I hope I'm doing well.
So I have a question. So you said that political power of the presidency is limited by the political costs of his decisions. And I say his because it's always been a him. But is that not also constrained in this particular environment when there's an imbalance of power and it's enforced by a fear of retribution? So I think that the culture of fear of losing one's job or that you could be attacked or sued constrains that possibility of a political cost. Do you think that's true?
Yes. No, I was going to answer some more. This is a classic, yes. This is a classic version of the question that I regularly get, which is, well, who cares? Like, that's not the, right. What I've presented to you is the Constitution of, what I call the Constitution of 1789, which is, by the way, the title of my book. And then some smart aleck said, what, don't you mean the Constitution of 1788? When it was ratified? I'm like, I have a whole explanation for why that's wrong. But okay, anyway, I'm talking about the Constitution of 1789. This is the original conception of the presidency. This is the original distribution of costs and benefits, which for its own sake is worth knowing. It is a separate question whether we should continue to be bound by that Constitution today. Now, I've hinted that actually this original solution sensibly balances in a much better way these competing interests of expertise on the one hand and accountability on the other. Then the president gets all the discretion view, and the president does not have a constitutional right view on the other. Okay? But you might disagree for the reasons you've just stated, right? Quite eloquently, which is, well, all of this presumes that those improper interferences, that the political costs will be real and actual because there's going to be a coordinate branch of government named Congress that isn't totally impotent and incompetent. And unfortunately, it's both, right? Now, why is it both? I mean, there are lots of ways you can diagnose this. Some people say, there's this is recorded, right? Well, they'll find out eventually what I think about them. There's this famous article, very, very, very famous. I wish my stuff was as cited. In the Harvard Law Review called The Separation of Parties, Not Powers, written by two famous law professors at the Harvard Law Review, I think it was in 2006, where they explained that the Madisonian separation of powers totally falls apart once you have parties and polarization because they're not going to follow their own institutional interests. They're going to rather work together to follow their party interests. Why was I hesitating about saying all this? Well, what I was going to say was actually this wasn't a novel idea at all. It is exactly what Frank Goodenow said in 1900 in his book Politics and Administration, which they didn't cite in that article. But This insight goes back to that, right? This idea that the Madisonian separation of powers implies that Congress will have its own interests and that the Republicans working in the House and in the Senate and the presidency will not undermine that institutional design when they control the three branches. And similarly, the Democrats won't do it when they control the three branches. But in fact, they do largely. Okay. Now, is it true that, entirely true that Congress doesn't look after its own institutional prerogatives? I mean, maybe it's true of the House. What does the House do? They barely even originate revenue bills anymore, right? They get around that. But the Senate, they have all these prerogatives with respect to appointments. Now they're chipping away at it, and they chipped away even more at it recently, because it takes two to tango, right? The more one side's obstructive, the more the other side is going to say, okay, enough of the institutional prerogatives. We're going to get rid of these things that have protected our prerogatives, like the filibuster, like this idea of X number of hours on debate per appointment, which they just got rid of, and so on. So the answer is yes. And what do you do with that? I don't know. I don't know exactly. My instinct is this is better than what we have, this view. Yes, ma'am. And the mic is right there. Yeah.
Thanks. Do you think that the Supreme Court will hold Trump responsible at any point in the future? And I realize that's a very general question, but what is your
You mean the Trump
intuition?
president?
Yes,
The
Trump presidency, yes.
I think at the end of the day, it is in a case or, in a proper case. Okay, so you do want me to talk about the courts. All right, fine. Let's try to avoid it. For those of you who are at lunch, sorry, I'm about to repeat something that I said there, which is, what is the role of the courts? It is not to hold the president responsible. It is Congress's job to hold, and we the people's job, right, to hold the president responsible. Whole separate question, basically, that you could follow up on the last one. Well, impeachment is totally dead, which if you were here a year and a half ago at the Progressive Conservative Summit, one amendment that we all agreed on, by the way, was to fix impeachment, right, and actually make it a little harder to initiate an impeachment and easier to convict, right, for this reason, right? But again, as originally hoped for, it was our responsibility. There's something in the debates of, I'm doing the weave, in 1789 that I didn't mention. Madison said, the wanton removal of meritorious officers by the president will make the president liable to his own removal from office. Okay? Now, of course, nobody takes that seriously anymore because of this combination of questions that we're getting. Right? But that was the original conception. What was the court's role in all of this? The court's role was to pronounce their understandings and interpretations of the law necessary to resolve a particular dispute before them, involving private parties usually, okay? Or private interests, I should say. The government could be on one side of this. So historically, President Trump deploys the National Guard. Who's going to hold the president accountable? Okay. Is it going to be Gavin Newsom and Charles Breyer, the federal judge in San Francisco? No. What is Gavin Newsom's cause of action? Goes back to the lunch discussion. Sorry. You need a cause of action. There was an old quip that, not every schoolyard dispute is a federal lawsuit. Today, less true, by the way. I feel like they're all kind of federal lawsuits waiting to happen, so be very careful. At this university, I'm looking at the general counsel here. But as a historical matter, it's true. Like, not every dispute is a lawsuit because you need a cause of action. You need to establish the elements of a tort of negligence. You need to establish the elements of a contract dispute, right? Congress, the states, legislatures can create causes of action. Gavin Newsom doesn't have a cause of action to sue. He has no legally cognizable injury. So how would the courts have, quote unquote, held the president responsible? Okay. Well, as soon as a National Guardsman, pursuant to orders issued by the president, goes and ransacks somebody's house and arrests them for interfering with law enforcement operations, or falsely or imprisons somebody or arrests someone who's interfering with ICE operations or whatever, that person now has a private lawsuit. If that person could establish the elements of false imprisonment, of trespass, of conversion of property. And in deciding that person's case, the courts can decide which law applies, Okay, the National Guardsman will say, well, I had orders from the president, and the court will then say, okay, those were unlawful orders. And therefore the government must pay this individual, or this individual must recover. Does that mean the National Guard leaves Los Angeles? No, the president is still the commander-in-chief, can still deploy the Guard. A court, a judge, in a case has pronounced its opinion, but in another case with another party and another judge, the judge might pronounce a different opinion. Eventually it'll get up to the Supreme Court. And then the Supreme Court, in deciding a real case or controversy, not in isolation, not as a council of revision, as a council of censors to hold the president responsible, but in its function as resolving disputes, will tell us what it thinks the law is. And even then, now this is the real controversial part, even then it doesn't mean the president has to follow the Supreme Court in other cases. This is the Dred Scott problem. I love this. Your question was, you had no idea where this was going, but you've given me a great hook to talk about whatever I felt like talking about, which is now Dred Scott. Oh, good. Well, I appreciate it. I actually paid her I planted that question. Okay. So after the Dred Scott decision was decided, what did Dred Scott hold? I mean, it held that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional, which is a problem, but right now it held that free persons of African descent were not and could not be citizens of the United States. And Buchanan and others said, oh, this has solved the problem. Okay, so Lincoln, in the Lincoln-Douglas debate, said, no, it hasn't solved the problem, and we don't have to follow the Dred Scott case in other instances. And Stephen Douglas said, he sounds like a modern American, right? Stephen Douglas said, how dare you? The Constitution establishes the Supreme Court to settle and resolve all questions of constitutional law. The Supreme Tribunal has spoken. Who are you going to appeal to? Lynch's law? The rule of the mob? And Lincoln said, nobody's defying the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has settled the rights of Dred Scott and John Sanford. And no one is purporting to spring Dred Scott free from the clutches of his master. It does not mean, Lincoln said, that I or Congress or anyone else has to follow the Supreme Court's reasoning as a political rule. Okay. So what are some examples of actions Lincoln took? Now, long term, by the way, of course, we're going to appoint new justices and get them to overturn this previous decision, right? But what did Lincoln and others do in the immediate aftermath? Well, not quite immediate. Lincoln had to be elected. The South seceded at that point. When he was president, he was confronted with statutes that authorized the grant of passports and coasting licenses to citizens of the United States. And so he had to decide who are citizens of the United States. He had Ed Bates, his attorney general, write an opinion that said African Americans have always been, free African Americans, had always been citizens of the United States, adopting the reasoning of the Dred Scott dissent, Benjamin Curtis. They were citizens of the United States. And then Lincoln said, I agree, I'm giving you passports and I'm giving you coasting licenses. Another great example, and then I'll stop. This is fun. Do you know who Hiram Revels is? Okay, probably not. So let me tell you who Hiram Revels is. Hiram Revels was the first African-American United States senator appointed by the reconstructed Mississippi legislature in 1870. What was the problem? The Constitution says to be a United States senator, you must have been a citizen of the United States for 9 years. If Dred Scott was the law of the land, the Supreme Court had final say on who was a citizen of the United States, then Hiram Revels had only been a citizen for 2 years, since 1868, since the adoption and ratification of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Could the Senate constitutionally seat him? They debated the question, and all the Democrats, of course, said, this is outrageous, it's unconstitutional. And all the Republicans said, you guys were wrong then, you're wrong now, sit down, we're seating him. And they seated him, right? This view that I've just articulated is called, in my book, this is great, you should have me back to do this exact same talk in like 6 months, okay? You can all pre-order the book. It's called departmentalism. It's this idea that each department of the government, for its purposes, has to interpret the Constitution. And some of their interpretations are never going to be judicially reviewable, and sometimes they will be. And the court's going to say something about the law, and Congress might think something else about the law, and the Senate might think something else, and the president. And that's just the give and take, the tug and pull, or the tug and pull, the push and pull, you know what I mean, of the separation of powers. Right? That's how it's supposed to work. The Supreme Court is not the final and ultimate arbiter. What ultimately said, that's probably a good idea for me to stop talking now, actually. Like, I really should treat that as an alarm to stop answering this question. But eventually, the people at large would acquiesce in a particular interpretation of the Constitution over time through various indications. Let me stop there. I got 10 minutes, just that question. I'm going to keep you at the edge of your seats until 7:30.
So you mentioned that just a couple weeks before the conclusion of the Constitutional Convention, the committee made this kind of sudden pivot to removing those powers that they initially had for appointment by the Senate in the draft of the Constitution. Do you know why they made that sudden shift to removing all these appointment powers to the president and only advice and consent from the Senate just at the very last minute like that?
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And I don't. I've not investigated that question specifically. What we do know is that there was some concern as to whether the Senate would be always in session, for example. And so can the Senate appoint ambassadors when the Senate's not in session? What's going to happen in that situation? And there was this general decision at the same time. For example, they gave the president the power to receive ambassadors. Well, if the Senate's not in session, how could the Senate receive the ambassadors? So from my recollection, and this is just a recollection, I have not specifically said, hey, why did they do that? So I'd have to go back and look precisely. But my understanding was a lot of changes were made out of concern that the Senate would not always be in session, but the president was on the clock 24/7, even at 3 a.m., right? For that phone call, like, oh, the ambassador needs to be appointed. That's the 3 a.m. phone call they were concerned about, right? Or telegraph or whatever. Letter packet. They were expecting at 3 in the morning. If there might be some more profound reason, and so I reserve judgment in case I've overlooked something. It's a great question. That one I can't filibuster.
So my question is, when you were talking about Lincoln and Dred Scott, if I'm pulled over and I don't have my Miranda rights read to me, and the officer simply says, hey, that was Mr. Miranda, and his rights, not yours, what's my argument?
Yeah. Well, really, it's what the police officer's argument would be, right? Because you want Miranda's arguments to apply to you, right? Because you're trying to get out of the speeding ticket or whatever it is that you've done. So really, it's the police officer's argument. Like, well, no, these Miranda warnings apply wait a minute, who would be making this argument? I think I've confused myself now, right? Right, because the police officer is going to say, oh, yeah, I forgot your Miranda warnings, but you aren't Miranda, right? That's what the police officer would say, right? And then the answer at some point is, sure, the officer could say that, and then it would be a suppression motion to suppress the evidence or whatever in a trial. And then the district judge will say, well, what do I have to do? Well, the Supreme Court has decided this case, and I have to follow the Supreme Court as precedent. But maybe after enough of these cases, if someone wants to bring a challenge to Miranda v. Arizona, just like they wanted to bring a challenge to Roe against Wade, eventually enough states or enough officers will act in a certain way to bring enough challenges to create enough momentum so that when it finally gets up to the Supreme Court, right, the Supreme Court will change the law, right? Departmentalism, it's a great question. Departmentalism has easy applications and hard applications. The easy applications are things like the coasting licenses and the passports, because those aren't judicially reviewable. Because who's injured by that decision to confer a passport on a free African American? It would never be a lawsuit. So there are certain Hiram Revels. How would that, are you going to say, well, he was the 51st vote on something, and so the law, I don't know, maybe, but it's highly unlikely that would ever be adjudicated, right? Then there are cases in which the Supreme Court has said something is constitutional. Does that prevent a president from saying, actually, no, I think it's unconstitutional, and so I'm going to veto a bill that does that? And that's how Andrew Jackson treated the Second Bank of the United States. The bank had been upheld as constitutional under the Necessary and Proper Clause in a case called McCulloch against Maryland in 1819. And in the 1830s, when they were reauthorizing the Second Bank, he said, I don't think it's necessary and proper anymore. I'm not bound by the Supreme Court's interpretation from 1819. And there's nothing the court can do about it, right? Because I'm just vetoing the law in the exercise of my power. President Jefferson, the courts held the alien and sedition, well, the sedition laws, let's focus on that, constitutional, the alien and sedition laws of 1798. And Jefferson said, okay, well, I'm pardoning everybody who has been convicted under the law because I think it was unconstitutional. And in the exercise of my pardon power, I can interpret the Constitution for myself. The hard case is the one you posed, where the Supreme Court has said something is unconstitutional, and then the government tries to do it anyway, because that's just going to get slapped down immediately from a lower court judge. It's the Roe v. Wade problem, right? It's the Missouri Compromise problem. It's the problem your hypothetical posed. And then the only way you do it is you need to bring enough repeated challenges to try to dislodge that decision. At the end of the day, this is an important point, which, well, I'm just filibustering, but again, this actually is an important point. Judges do not send their law clerks to the government printing office to delete provisions from the United States Code. That is still there to be applied. When Roe v. Wade was overturned in Dobbs, all of these states had abortion laws that were on the statutes from like the territorial days, like the 1800s. Why? Because they're there. They're there on the books. Always applicable. In the 50 years since Roe v. Wade was decided, at any time, the government could have come in and said, hey, look, this is a statute that binds us. And then the court said, okay, but that's a state law. The Supreme Court has interpreted the federal Constitution differently. But as soon as that goes away, you still have the state law to look to. There is no law requiring Miranda warnings. So the officer could say, hey, no law required this, right? But then the judge will deploy the Supreme Court precedent, and eventually maybe you can dislodge it, right? Anyway, thank you for that opportunity. Was there,
We're going to take one final question.
I've got 2.5 minutes.
Just to take that a little bit further.
This is one of the lawyers in the room. I plead the fifth. I'm not no good.
We'll try to keep it on theme.
Okay.
So this conversation you're having, kind of these independent constitutional actors, people from the president to maybe the city clerk here in Grand Rapids, are commanded.
Can you issue a marriage certificate?
They all raise their hand, swear an oath to the Constitution, defend the Constitution. The situations you just talked about, where the Supreme Court has ruled on something and the Supreme Court's position is clear, or there's a specific congressional statute.
Are they violating their oaths?
Commanding a certain cause of action. To bring it back to citizenship, the Trump executive order, and maybe assuming, there's certainly statutes on the books, there's Supreme Court precedent at play, but maybe assuming those things don't fully answer the question. I'd be interested in your view about this kind of independent constitutional actor theory and how it plays out, assuming the Supreme Court hasn't expressed a clear answer, and assuming there's not a statutory answer. What are presidents, city clerks, and everyone in between supposed to do in upholding that oath to defend the Constitution?
This is an excellent question. And in most situations, it's just defiance, right? So like the city clerk not issuing a marriage certificate, to a same-sex couple or something like that. But yours is just sort of more open-ended and unanswered question, like, is the president an officer within the meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, right? Such that if he has engaged in rebellion or insurrection? Rebellion? I mean, they're the same thing. What's the term that it uses? Anyway, or shall have engaged in insurrection, I think maybe, can't be eligible, right? For any office under the authority of the United States. Can a county clerk in Maricopa County make a decision? Or the Secretary of State in Colorado, right? And I actually think the answer is yes, they have an independent duty to interpret the Constitution in that respect. Now, there are lots of problems. If the answer turns out to be you need congressional enforcement legislation under Section 5, then they don't have authority to do that. But they get to interpret that question too, right? The county clerk can say, I've read Section 5, and I don't, I think the 14th Amendment is independently enforceable. I don't need congressional legislation, so it's my duty to interpret this. Is the president an officer of the United States within the meaning of this? Probably not, by the way, though very fancy law professors who are dear friends of mine say otherwise. They lost 9-0 though, the Supreme Court. So, that's something. Anyway, so they could decide that question. They could decide what insurrection is. Does the president engage in insurrection? Yes, everybody I think has a duty who takes an oath to interpret the Constitution for their purposes, which is why the Section 3 litigation was challenging but not because that was wrong that they all did that, right? It's because the implications are wrong and 50,000 different people who are relevant, the county recorders and the ballot, the secretaries of state, and could have different opinions on the question, which is why the Supreme Court ruled as it did, which, if I'm recalling correctly, was Congress needs to pass enforcement legislation. Congress needs to decide that something has been an insurrection and so on. And that solves the problem. I don't know if that was the right answer, but it definitely solves the problem of 50,000 different officers who've taken oaths to the Constitution who have a relevant duty interpreting that provision for themselves. It's a messy system. It is a messy system. But isn't having a messy system better than a system in which the Supreme Court gets to decide through a decision cases of constitutional interpretation for 5 decades, for all time, including like the Dred Scott? By the way, let's end on a happy note. The Supreme Court has been wrong about almost everything for almost all of its history. Right? I mean, when you really think about the key, like famous cases, it was right about most things in the Marshall Court era, but then you got Dred Scott. They totally flubbed the 14th Amendment in the late 19th century, the early 20th century. You know, it's, look, today, so a lot of people, half the country thinks they're getting everything wrong today. I'm actually more sanguine about what they're doing today. But isn't it better to have that messiness and that give and take and those different sources of interpretive power? In other words, isn't this a way of concluding on Constitution Day that ultimately it's our Constitution and we all have a role in interpreting it in various ways? So on that cheesy note, I guess I'll stop. Okay, thank you. Mutation or whatever that, there you go. Like,
I think you can handle it just fine.
well, thank you.
I just want to thank you all again for coming. Thank Professor Werman for enlightening us with some great concepts and ideas tonight. I'm sure we all learned something. Much to his chagrin, our next program is October 2nd on the Supreme Court. We'll have James Formosa, the
Boring. Oh, sorry.
legal editor from Politico will be here along with Elizabeth Price Foley from Florida International University. They will do a review of the Supreme Court's docket, which is great. And aside from that, thank you all again for being here. Please enjoy some dessert in the reception area, and we'll see you on October.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, let's see if we can get this out. I hope you'll have me back.
Well, that's what I